Hello, everyone, and welcome to the lecture on race and ethnicity. Today, we are going to dive into some key ideas about race and ethnicity, concepts that shape how societies function and how we navigate the world. Let's start with race. Race is not about biology. It's what we call a socially constructed category. This means that society has created the idea of race based on certain physical traits, like skin color or facial features, that it decides are important. These ideas aren't fixed. They vary across different cultures and can change over time. Now, here's a bit of historical context. In the 19th century, biologists tried to classify people into racial types. Terms like Caucasoid, Negroid, and Mongoloid came from these efforts. But modern science has shown that these categories are misleading. There are no such thing as biologically pure races. Human populations have always been interconnected, sharing and blending genetic traits over generations. Canada is a great example of this. Our population is incredibly diverse, reflecting generations of intermixing. This diversity really challenges the idea of distinct separate races and shows us how fluid these categories are. Now, let's shift our focus to ethnicity. Ethnicity is different from race in that it's less about physical traits and more about shared cultural heritage. It's about the traditions, customs, languages, and histories that connect people to their cultural roots. Unlike race, which is often something assigned from the outside, ethnicity is more about how people identify themselves and where they feel they belong culturally. Ethnicity is also much more flexible and layered. Many people identify with more than one ethnic background. For instance, someone might identify as both Italian and Cree, or as Jamaican and Chinese. In a multicultural society like Canada, these blended identities are not only common but celebrated. They reflect the rich and evolving mix of cultures that shape both individuals and the nation as a whole. Canada is a truly multi-ethnic society. We have two official languages and people from dozens of ethnic groups. This diversity highlights how ethnicity is socially constructed. Its importance depends on how people choose to define and express it. Because of this, ethnicity often involves even more variation and mixture than race does. Now let's bring in another key idea: minorities. A minority refers to any category of people who are distinguished by physical or cultural differences that a society sets apart and subordinates. Minorities share two main characteristics. They have a distinctive identity, and they experience some form of subordination or unequal treatment. It's important to note that not every member of a minority group faces disadvantage in the same way, but race or ethnicity often becomes what we call a master status, a key trait that shapes how others perceive and respond to someone. And while the term minority might suggest a small group, that's not always the case. For example, in Canada, the term visible minority refers to people, other than Indigenous peoples, who are non-Caucasian in race or non-white in color. In some cities, visible minorities actually make up a large share of the population, showing that minority is more about social position than simple numbers. Let's take a look at prejudice and stereotypes, two concepts that strongly shape how we perceive and interact with others. They're powerful social forces, but they're also often misunderstood. Prejudice at its core is a prejudgment. It's a rigid and unfair generalization about an entire group of people. What's interesting is that prejudice isn't always negative. It can also be positive when we overly praise a group or make assumptions that seem complimentary. But in both cases, prejudice is problematic because it reduces people to group labels rather than recognizing them as individuals with unique experiences and qualities. Stereotypes are closely linked to prejudice. A stereotype is an oversimplified or exaggerated belief about people who belong to a particular category. These generalizations might seem harmless at first, but they can have serious consequences. For example, in workplaces, stereotypes can lead employers to make assumptions about someone's competence, work ethic, or intelligence based on their race, ethnicity, or gender, rather than their actual skills or performance. When stereotypes influence decisions like hiring, promotion, or even day-to-day interactions, they reinforce inequality and create barriers, especially for people from minority groups. So, understanding prejudice and stereotypes isn't just about recognizing bias in others, it's also about becoming more aware of how these patterns of thinking can quietly shape our own behavior in the institutions we participate in. So, how do we actually measure prejudice? One common way is through something called social distance. Social distance refers to how willing people are to interact with members of certain groups and how close they feel comfortable being to them in different social situations. For example, would someone feel comfortable having a person from a particular group as a coworker, a neighbor, or even a family member through marriage? To study this, sociologist Emery Bogardus developed what's known as the social distance scale back in the 1920s. It's a 7-point scale that ranges from one extreme, wanting to completely exclude a group from the country, to the other end, which represents full acceptance, like being comfortable with someone from that group marrying into your family. The closer a person is willing to get on that scale, the lower their level of prejudice. When we look at more recent data, especially among college and university students, we see some interesting trends. First, there's a clear movement toward greater acceptance of different groups compared to the past. Second, people today tend to see fewer differences among minority groups. They're more likely to view minorities as part of a shared social fabric rather than as separate or distant categories. However, prejudice is not static. It can shift with larger social events. For instance, after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, there was a noticeable rise in social distance toward Arabs and Muslims. This shows how prejudice is deeply influenced by societal context, media portrayals, and global events. So the social distance scale gives us a useful way to see how prejudice changes over time, reflecting both cultural progress and the lingering effects of fear or misunderstanding that can arise in certain moments of history. Now we'll turn to racism, a particularly harmful and persistent form of prejudice. Racism is the belief that one racial group is naturally superior or inferior to another. It's not just about individual attitudes or personal bias, it's also embedded within social systems and institutions. Racism operates both on a personal level, through everyday interactions, and on a structural level, through policies and practices that create and sustain inequality. Canada, like many other countries, has its own history of racism. Before Confederation, slavery was practiced here, even though it's often overlooked in our national story. In more recent times, researchers have highlighted how racism can intersect with other forms of inequality, such as sexism and discrimination against immigrants. These overlapping forms of bias can compound disadvantage and exclusion. It's also important to note that racial differences in things like intelligence or ability are not biological. They're shaped by environment, access to resources, and opportunity. When we look closely, what we often call racial differences are actually reflections of social inequality rather than innate traits. One perspective that helps us understand this is critical race theory. This framework argues that racism is deeply embedded in the fabric of society. It's not just about a few prejudiced individuals, but about systems and institutions that continue to privilege some groups over others. In other words, even if most people aren't personally racist, the system itself can still produce racist outcomes. Understanding racism in this broader, systemic sense allows us to see why it persists and what needs to change for society to become more equitable. So, why does prejudice exist? Sociologists have developed a few key theories to help explain it, and one of the most well-known is the scapegoat theory. Scapegoat theory suggests that prejudice often grows out of frustration. When people experience difficulties, stress, or feel powerless in their own lives, they may look for someone else to blame for their problems. This someone is usually a scapegoat, a person or group that has less social power and can be easily targeted. For example, when the economy is struggling or when jobs are scarce, people might direct their anger toward immigrants or minority groups, even though those groups aren't actually responsible for the larger issue. In this way, prejudice becomes a way for people to vent their frustrations without addressing the real sources of inequality or hardship. Scapegoat theory helps us see that prejudice isn't always about deep personal hatred. It can also be a reaction to social and economic pressures that get unfairly directed at vulnerable groups. Now let's take a closer look at the authoritarian personality theory, which links prejudice to certain personality traits rather than just to social or economic conditions. This perspective emerged from research that tried to understand why some people are more inclined toward prejudice and intolerance than others, even when they grow up in similar environments. According to this theory, people with an authoritarian personality tend to have a strong respect for authority figures and establish social hierarchies. They value obedience, order, and tradition, and they often believe that the world works best when everyone knows their place. These individuals are typically uncomfortable with uncertainty or change and are more likely to conform to the dominant norms of their society. Because of this rigid worldview, they tend to divide people into categories of us and them. Those who fit within their sense of order, people who share their values, culture, or beliefs, are viewed positively, while those who differ are often seen as threatening or inferior. This mindset can make them more susceptible to prejudiced attitudes and discriminatory behavior. The authoritarian personality theory reminds us that prejudice isn't only learned from society, it can also be reinforced by deeper psychological needs for control, certainty, and belonging. Understanding this helps explain why some people are especially resistant to diversity or social change, even when broader cultural attitudes are becoming more open and accepting. On the other hand, the culture theory of prejudice takes a broader view, suggesting that prejudice isn't just about individual personalities or frustrations. It's something that exists within the culture itself. According to this perspective, everyone absorbs some level of prejudice simply by being part of a society where bias and stereotypes are woven into everyday values, language, and norms. In other words, prejudice isn't limited to a few individuals. It's part of the cultural fabric. We learn it through socialization, often without even realizing it. From media representations to casual jokes to family conversations, cultural messages can subtly reinforce ideas about which groups are valued and which are not. Bogardus's work on the social distance scale ties into this theory by showing how cultural attitudes shape how close or distant people feel towards certain groups. When we measure people's comfort levels with members of different social categories, we're really seeing reflections of the cultural norms that define insiders and outsiders. The conflict theory of prejudice takes a structural approach by focusing on power and inequality. This perspective argues that prejudice is not just about personal feelings or misunderstandings. It's a tool used by powerful groups to maintain their advantages and justify the subordination of others. According to this theory, prejudice helps reinforce existing hierarchies. By portraying some groups as inferior or undeserving, those in power can legitimize systems that keep wealth, opportunities, and influence concentrated in their own hands. For example, in societies shaped by white privilege, white people often receive unearned advantages, such as not having to worry that their race will negatively affect how they're treated in education, employment, or by institutions. Importantly, they don't have to be consciously racist to still benefit from this unequal system. Today, some people claim to be colorblind, saying they don't see race. But this so-called colorblindness can actually allow inequality to persist by ignoring the structural racism that continues to shape people's life chances. At the same time, the conflict perspective recognizes that marginalized groups may respond by developing greater race consciousness, an awareness of how race and ethnicity shape their position in society. This awareness can become a form of empowerment, helping people organize, advocate, and push for equity and justice. So conflict theory helps us see prejudice not as random or accidental, but as something deeply tied to power dynamics and the ongoing struggle over resources, recognition, and rights. Now, let's move on to two closely connected ideas: discrimination and how majority and minority groups interact. These concepts help us see how prejudice moves from attitudes into action. Discrimination is about behavior. While prejudice involves beliefs or judgments about a group, discrimination is when those beliefs lead to unequal treatment. Just like prejudice, discrimination can go in either direction. It can involve unfair advantage or unfair disadvantage. But in most cases, it refers to negative treatment that restricts opportunities or access to resources. Discrimination can happen on two levels. The first is individual discrimination, where one person's bias directly affects another. For example, refusing to hire someone because of their race or ethnicity. The second is institutional discrimination, which occurs when prejudice becomes built into the policies, practices, or structures of major institutions. In Canada, one clear example of institutional discrimination is the Indian Act. This piece of legislation created systems that marginalized Indigenous peoples, restricted their rights, and limited their autonomy. Over time, these kinds of institutional biases not only reflect existing prejudice, but also help to reproduce it by shaping public attitudes and maintaining inequality. What makes this even more complex is that prejudice and discrimination feed off each other in a cycle. People's prejudiced beliefs lead to discriminatory actions, and those actions then seem to confirm the original stereotypes, creating what we call a vicious circle. This self-reinforcing loop keeps inequality alive across generations. This idea connects with the Thomas theorem, which states that if people define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. In other words, if people act on stereotypes or false beliefs, those actions can produce very real social outcomes like segregation, unequal education, or employment gaps that appear to prove the stereotype true. Breaking this cycle requires both individual reflection and structural change, because as long as prejudice and discrimination reinforce one another, inequality continues to reproduce itself through everyday actions and institutional practices. Let's talk about how majority and minority groups interact within a society. Sociologists describe these relationships using four main models: pluralism, assimilation, segregation, and genocide. Each one represents a different type of interaction and a different balance of power between groups. We'll start with pluralism. Pluralism occurs when racial and ethnic groups maintain their cultural distinctions but share equal social standing. In theory, Canada presents itself as a pluralistic society. Everyone has equal rights under the law, and diversity is valued as part of our national identity. But in practice, that ideal doesn't always translate into full equality. Legal equality doesn't necessarily mean equal access to resources, opportunities, or social acceptance, so gaps in privilege and power still exist. Next is assimilation, which is when minority groups gradually adopt the culture of the dominant group. This can include changes in language, style of dress, traditions, or even values. Over generations, this process can lead to the blending of cultural traits. However, while ethnic identity can shift through assimilation, racial traits like skin color don't disappear unless there's biological mixing, or what we call miscegenation. The extent of assimilation varies greatly across societies and depends on how open the dominant culture is to newcomers, as well as how much pressure minority groups feel to conform. Then there's segregation, which is all about separation. Segregation can be physical or social, and sometimes it happens voluntarily when people choose to live or gather with others who share their culture, but far more often, it's imposed by the dominant group to maintain control or inequality. Historical examples include racial segregation laws in the United States before the Civil Rights Movement, where separation was legally enforced in housing, schools, and public spaces. Even today, forms of informal or economic segregation continue in many parts of the world. Finally, genocide is the most extreme form of majority-minority interaction. It's the deliberate and systematic killing of one group by another. Genocide represents what can happen when prejudice and discrimination escalate unchecked, when entire groups are dehumanized and targeted for elimination. It's a tragic reminder of the consequences of extreme intolerance and the importance of actively challenging prejudice before it reaches that point. Each of these models shows a different way that societies manage diversity, from coexistence and blending to separation and destruction. They remind us that relationships between groups are not fixed. They're shaped by power, history, and the choices societies make about inclusion and equality. Canada's history and its current population reflect an incredible diversity of cultures, languages, and traditions. But this diversity also tells a story of unequal experiences. Some groups have been embraced and integrated more easily, while others have faced systemic barriers, exclusion, and ongoing discrimination. Let's begin with Indigenous peoples, the original inhabitants of the land we now call Canada. Before European contact, Indigenous peoples lived in hundreds of distinct societies. Nations such as the Mi'kmaq, Cree, Mohawk, Haida, and many others, each with its own language, culture, governance, and way of life. When Europeans arrived, they brought with them diseases that indigenous populations had no immunity to, and they imposed racist attitudes and colonial systems that devastated communities. Europeans also mislabeled these groups as Indians, a mistake based on their belief that they had reached India. The impacts of colonization were profound and long-lasting. Indigenous peoples were decimated not only by disease and military conflict, but also through policies of forced assimilation, such as the residential school system. These schools sought to erase indigenous cultures, languages, and identities, leaving deep scars that still affect communities today. As of the 2016 census, about 4.9% of Canada's population identified as Indigenous, First Nations, Métis, or Inuit. This population is greatly and represents an incredible diversity of nations and cultures. Yet, despite being the first peoples of this land, Indigenous communities continue to experience systemic inequalities. These include poorer health outcomes, barriers to education and employment, overrepresentation in the criminal justice system, high numbers of children in state care, and lower life expectancy compared to non-Indigenous Canadians. However, the story is not only one of hardship, it's also one of resilience and renewal. Many Indigenous peoples are actively reclaiming their languages, traditions, and governance systems. There's a powerful movement toward cultural pride, self-determination, and the negotiation of land and treaty rights. Across the country, Indigenous communities are leading efforts to rebuild, resist, and restore what colonialism sought to erase. Next, let's talk about British Canadians, sometimes referred to as WASPs, which stands for White Anglo-Saxon Protestants. This group has played a dominant role in shaping Canadian society since the early days of colonization. It's important to remember that British Canadians were never a single uniform group. They include people of English, Scottish, Welsh, and Irish descent, each bringing their own traditions and cultural influences. According to the 2021 census, English, Scottish, and Irish backgrounds are among the most commonly reported British origins in Canada. Over 5 million people identified as English, more than 4 million as Irish, and another 4 million as Scottish. Historically, many British immigrants arrived with advantages that helped them gain influence early on. They often had access to education, professional skills, and social networks that eased their integration into colonial life. Many also carried a belief in the Protestant work ethic, a cultural value that emphasized hard work, self-discipline, and moral responsibility. These attitudes, combined with political power and economic opportunity, allowed British settlers to establish and maintain dominance within Canadian institutions. We can still see the legacy of this influence today. Canada's legal and political systems are rooted in British models, from parliamentary democracy to common law. English remains the dominant language in business, government, and media, reflecting the lasting cultural authority of British Canadians. French Canadians, along with the British, were among the earliest European settlers in what would become Canada. French explorers first arrived in the 16th century, drawn initially by fishing and fur trading opportunities, and later by the hope of building new lives in New France. They established strong roots, particularly in the St. Lawrence Valley, and laid the cultural and linguistic foundations of what is now Quebec. For centuries, French Canadians have had a distinct political and cultural identity. After the British conquest in the 18th century, French speakers were placed at a disadvantage, both politically and economically, under British rule. However, this began to change during the Quiet Revolution of the early 1960s, a period of rapid social, political, and cultural transformation in Quebec. During this time, the province modernized its institutions, expanded access to education, and developed a renewed sense of national pride and identity. The tension between English and French communities in Canada has often been described as the two solitudes. This term captures the historical separation and limited interaction between the two dominant linguistic and cultural groups. Over the years, debates about identity, culture, and autonomy have been central to Quebec's political landscape. Movements for Quebec sovereignty and separatist political parties, such as the Parti Québécois and the Bloc Québécois, were particularly strong in the late 20th century. Though support for separation declined after the 1995 referendum, interest in protecting and promoting the French language and culture remains powerful. In fact, in recent years, we've seen renewed action on this front. In 2022, Quebec's provincial government expanded French language requirements in the province, reinforcing the central place of French in education, business, and public life. Canada's immigration story unfolds in several distinct waves, each of which has helped shape the country's identity and diversity today. The first wave of immigration came in the 17th and 18th centuries, when French settlers established New France. They built communities along the St. Lawrence River and created many of the cultural and linguistic foundations that still define Quebec today. The second wave occurred in the 1800s and was dominated by British immigrants. This included the United Empire Loyalists, who fled north from the American colonies after the American Revolution, as well as newcomers arriving directly from England, Scotland, and Ireland. These groups reinforced British cultural, political, and economic dominance in Canada during that period. The third wave, at the turn of the 20th century, brought a large influx of immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe, people from countries like Ukraine, Italy, and Poland, many of whom came seeking farmland and economic opportunity in the expanding prairie provinces. Around the same time, groups such as the Chinese also arrived, often facing harsh discrimination. The Chinese head tax, for example, was a fee imposed only on Chinese immigrants, a clear example of how race and ethnicity shaped immigration policy. The fourth wave began after World War II and continues into the present. This period saw a major shift in immigration patterns, with more people arriving from Asia, Latin America, Africa, and the Caribbean. Many of these newcomers came from low and middle income countries, drawn by the promise of opportunity and safety. Today, most new immigrants to Canada are visible minorities, reflecting the country's increasing diversity and its official commitment to multiculturalism. Each of these waves added new layers to Canada's cultural fabric, shaping a nation that is both deeply influenced by its colonial past and continually transformed by global migration. Let's continue by looking at visible minorities, a term used in Canada to describe people other than Indigenous peoples who are non-Caucasian in race or non-white in color. Visible minorities now make up a significant and growing part of the Canadian population, and their experiences shed light on both the successes and ongoing challenges of multiculturalism. According to the 2016 census, most visible minorities live in major urban centers. About 39% of all visible minorities live in Toronto, 15% in Vancouver, nearly 12% in Montreal, and about 6% in Calgary. Together, these cities form the heart of Canada's multicultural landscape. Visible minorities now represent roughly 21.6% of the Canadian labor force, but their full integration into society is still incomplete. Despite being more likely, on average, to hold university degrees, visible minorities tend to earn lower incomes than the national average. This gap reflects barriers such as employment discrimination and unequal access to opportunities. Research shows that job applicants with English-sounding names are nearly 40% more likely to be called for an interview than those with names perceived as non-English. Historically, visible minority immigrants faced explicit exclusion and discrimination. For example, the Chinese head tax, a fee imposed solely on Chinese immigrants, wasn't abolished until 1948. Other restrictive policies, like the Continuous Journey Regulation of 1908, were designed to limit immigration from Asia. These policies laid the groundwork for long-term inequality that still has ripple effects today. Even in recent years, visible minorities continue to face disparities. In 2022, the unemployment rate for visible minorities was 6.1%, compared to 4.5% for non-visible minorities. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, racism surged, particularly against Asian Canadians, who experienced a 301% increase in hate crimes during that period. While most people agree that Canadian society is unequal, and that much of this inequality is tied to race and ethnicity, there's far less agreement on how to deal with it. The debate often reflects where people fall on the political spectrum. On the conservative side, people tend to be more accepting of social inequality, seeing it as a natural result of individual differences in talent, effort, or ambition. From this perspective, society's role is to ensure equality of opportunity, that everyone should have a fair shot at success, but not necessarily equality of outcomes. Conservatives often oppose policies like affirmative action or quotas because they view these as unfair advantages that interfere with merit-based achievement. The goal, in their view, should be to remove barriers such as overt discrimination, not to guarantee equal results. On the other hand, those on the progressive or left-leaning side are generally more critical of social inequality. They argue that differences in outcomes aren't just the result of individual effort, but reflect systemic bias, deeply embedded in the structures and institutions of society. From this perspective, race and ethnicity shape how people are perceived, treated, and given access to resources and opportunities. Progressives often believe that society itself is fundamentally racist because most of its major institutions, like government, education, media, and business, have historically been controlled by white people and continue to reflect those power dynamics. So while both perspectives recognize inequality, they differ in how they interpret its causes and solutions. Conservatives focus on removing explicit barriers to individual opportunity, while progressives emphasize the need to address institutional racism and unequal systems that sustain privilege. Understanding this divide helps explain why conversations about race, policy, and equality can be so polarized in Canada today. Let's wrap up by looking ahead to the future of race and ethnicity in Canada. One thing we can say with confidence is that Canada has always been, and will likely continue to be, a land of immigrants. Since the year 2000, Canada has welcomed, on average, more than 250,000 newcomers each year. This steady flow of immigration has created a country rich in cultural diversity, shaping everything from our food and music to our neighborhoods and workplaces. But with that diversity also come challenges. Many new arrivals still face the same kinds of prejudice and discrimination that earlier immigrants encountered. These can appear in everyday ways, through barriers in housing, employment, or education, and sometimes through more subtle forms of exclusion. One term that captures this resistance is xenophobia, which literally means fear of what is strange. Xenophobia reflects hostility or suspicion toward foreigners and often makes it harder for immigrants to feel fully accepted in their new home. Despite these obstacles, there are also powerful signs of resilience and renewal. Just as Indigenous peoples across Canada are experiencing a cultural revival, reclaiming languages, traditions, and pride and identity, many immigrants are finding their own balance between old and new. They are embracing Canadian society while still holding on to their heritage and cultural roots. This blending of identities enriches Canada's social fabric. It challenges old notions of what it means to be Canadian and pushes us to see multiculturalism as more than just coexistence. It's about mutual growth and cultural exchange. For many new arrivals, their racial and ethnic identities are no longer marks of difference or inferiority, but sources of pride and strength. So as we look to the future, the story of race and ethnicity in Canada continues to evolve. It's a story of diversity, resilience, and the ongoing work of building a society where everyone can belong, contribute, and be valued for who they are.